So we're going to dive straight into it. Manon, in this book, you have done something that many people, perhaps even most of our age range and beyond, are quite afraid of doing, which is talking clearly, openly, and intelligently about sex. And in fact,
thank you.
And in fact, one of your main points that you open the book with is that that sex is actually quite challenging for people to talk about, and a lot of the times that we do talk about it, we are not doing so in adequate terms. So can you quickly explain to us why you think that sex is so challenging to define and to discuss?
So, yeah, thank you. So, yes, one of the things I tried to do with this book is talk openly about sex, because I do think that this is very difficult and that this is very important, in the sense that one of the things that we need in our intimate lives is a vocabulary to talk about what we want, what we like, but also not just to other people, but also to ourselves, to figure out what we want and what we like and how we think we could reach what we want. And for that, we need to have words. And we don't have them. And we feel like it's extremely weird to talk about sex. It's extremely uncomfortable. We have, so of course, religion played a very big role in making us feel like it's something dirty, it's something forbidden. So different religions in different ways. I think Judaism, for instance, is less so normative about like how bad sex would be. It's actually conceived at it was very interesting for me to discover that in Judaism it's considered a good action to pleasure your wife, which is not exactly the same in Christianity, for instance. And so, so we need to look at our disgust or embarrassment, and my idea is that the more we talk about sex, the easier it is to talk about sex, and the easier it is to say what we don't want. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm seeing a kid arriving. Hi. It's not PG-13. It's okay? Oh, okay, you're going to the...
Everyone gets to learn about sex tonight.
Okay,
Fabulous.
well, great.
It's great. And so it's interesting because there's a difficulty in talking about sex because it's embarrassing, it's shameful, it's immoral, and then there's also the challenge of defining precisely what it is, because it's this sort of wide spectrum collection of possible acts. It's hard to say when the act that is not sex stops and the act that is sex begins. It can often involve something that happens before and something that happens after. And then there's also the problem of not being able to say precisely what sex is not. And so you offer a very funny and a very interesting critique of a very popular advertisement in the UK that maybe many people have seen here about consent, saying that consent is like a cup of tea.
Yeah, so it was very interesting for me, this whole like visual to say, oh yeah, like you're very good at understanding when someone doesn't want a cup of tea, and you're not going to force them to have a cup of tea, and so why would you force anyone to have sex? And how is it that you feel like it's okay when you would never like pour tea over someone's throat? And but I think there's like it's efficient, it's powerful, it makes you see things that are hard to see otherwise. But I think it misses the fact that there's something very specific about sex, to the extent that if someone really forces you to have tea, it's gonna be fine, and you're not, and also because you won't have this narrative that if you're forced by someone to have tea, you're gonna be ruined forever, that you're never gonna recover from it. So we have also this whole cultural narrative that says that women who have been victims of sexual violence are wounded in a way that is beyond repair, which I think came from a good intention of taking seriously the harms of sexual violation that are very real, but that also make victims of sexual violations feel like there's no recovery possible. There's no, you become damaged goods in a way, which is a very sexist idea of, so what I mean to say, let me be clear. What I mean to say is not to say that it's not true that you can be suffering for your whole life after having been victim of sexual violence. Like, of course it is true, but I think there is something ideological and sexist in this narrative of rape victims can never have a good sexuality after it, etc. That comes from an idea that you're used goods, you know, and that comes from an idea that another man has like damaged you, and so you're no good for the men after that. And so I think we need to think about what good intentions can do. But all of this to say, I think even for victims of sexual violation, there is something about talking about what happened, being able to distinguish the rape that they were victims of, or the sexual violations that they experienced, and distinguish it from their sex lives. And I think this is one of the things I'm trying to do also in the book, of saying I'm not so sure it's such a good idea to present the difference between rape and sex was just consent. To say like, either there was consent and it was sex, or there was no consent and it was rape. Because that makes it look like, depending on what the victim did, it's sex or it's consent. But victims of sexual violence tell you, well, it's not what I did that made it sexual violence or that made it sex. It's what was done to me. And we need to refocus on who does the sexual violence, and that I'm also suspicious about consent, that it can be used to just say, well, you didn't say no, so it was just normal sex. And it has nothing to do with what this other person did to you or the harm that was done to you. It's just, you should have stopped him if you didn't want it, so it's on you.
And we're going to talk a lot about consent and the problem of consent too. But I want to highlight as well, this book is called The Joy of Consent. It's not just about sexual violence and rape. It's also about how sex can be wonderful and good. And this is also something you address when you critique the tea argument, is that no one's had their life changed by a really good cup of tea. I don't know how much people in the audience love tea, but you make the point very, very correctly that good sex can also change your life, and that a philosophical project concerned with sex should be concerned with making sex qualitatively better, not just contending with the negative aspect of sex, the traumatic aspect of sex, which is sexual violation. And so it's important to strike that balance as well.
I just a caveat. I'm sure there are people for whom tea has a life-defining... No, but it's true. Like, if you're really into tea, like, it can be something. But what I mean is that for most people, sex has a very important place in their lives, and it's not the case for all people about tea. But it's true that I've been a bit worried. So this book comes also from a certain worry I've had that the growing discussion about consent as being something like, all we can say about sex now is it consensual, non-consensual? It has very good sides. So it comes from a good thing, and we need to not lose sight of this. It comes from the fact that up until the 70s or 80s, when we were thinking about sex, we were thinking about normal versus pathological, or normal versus criminal. So who should be locked up? Who should be put in psychiatric hospitals? Who should be criminalized for having gay sex, for having a lot of... And so the move towards a binarity of consensual, non-consensual, instead of normal, pathological, was good. There's no doubt about this. And it came from a suspicion towards all moralism in sex matters. But the result is that I feel like we reached a point where we're told the only thing we can talk about in sex is what is wrong about sex. And at the best, we can think about what is sex that is not wrong, but there is no possibility of a discussion about what is good about sex, because that might be moralistic. and that might be telling people what kind of lives they should be living, etc. And I think this is super sad, and also really missing the fact that sex has a place in our freedom. It's important to be free from sexual violence and free to have the sex that we want to have, but it also has a significant place in our good life, in the sense of in our quest of happiness and of a fulfilling life.
Yeah, basic bodily enjoyment, same as eating a delicious meal or spending a lovely night with friends. Absolutely.
Can I just follow your
follow
parallel,
away,
because
please, yes.
I think so. To be completely honest, I was not initially very happy with the title of the book, because I think in French, the title is La conversation des sexes, une philosophie du consentement. So the conversation of the sexes, a philosophy of consent. But it's, I was told, a bit too abstract for Anglophone readership. But we can get back to this in a minute. And so my publisher initially wanted to call it the sexiness of consent, which I was very strongly opposing. And so we ended up deciding that it would be the joy of consent, because part of my book is to think about joy and happiness in sex. But I know that my publisher liked it because for a lot of Americans, it reminds them of the joy of sex. And so of this idea that we're gonna, so for those of you who don't know, was a book in the 70s or 80s that was a sort of manual for a good sex life or something like that. And I was not really fond of this, because I think then people are gonna look at the book and expect recipes about good sex, and this is not what I'm doing. But then I found out, talking about recipes, that there's also a very famous book called The Joy of Cooking. And I'm way happier with the parallel between sex and cooking than the parallel between my book and a sort of manual of sex. Why? Partly because I think, so first of all, I think the analogy with cooking is good because it shows how it's something you learn over time. And that you can become good at it when you really were not very good at it at the beginning, and you get good at it by tasting it and seeing that it tastes wrong and it's not what you wanted. And so there's a whole trial and error going on about cooking and about sex. But also because I think it shows us the importance of a non-strictly individual vision. What I mean by this is that in France, and also in the US actually, there's this whole idea that talking about sex is going to destroy the magical aspect of sex. That suddenly it's going to it's going to flatten it, it's going to be a love kill, etc. But one thing I realized thinking about it is that you would never go to a Michelin star restaurant alone. Because part of enjoying a meal in a Michelin star restaurant is talking with the person you're eating with and saying, oh yeah, I really like this texture of this thing, and oh wow, that really surprises me. And everyone agrees, like even in Germany, where they're not really Michelin star oriented, they agree that...
Sorry, German watchers.
No, but what I mean by that is that it's not a cultural, very important experience to have very good food together, but everyone can see that talking about the food that you're having when you're having good food makes your pleasure of having food way greater. And so I'm very surprised, you know, in France you have these very famous intellectuals like Alain Finkielkraut who really believe in the power of language and how language shapes civilization, and they're like, oh no, but these feminists, they want us to talk about sex. This is disgusting. No, this is gonna kill our sex. And I think, well, you believe in the power of language, so why? And I think the reason why they're so skeptical about it is because they're actually very uncomfortable about it. Yeah. And because they are very worried to be told that they don't do things well, and that they're, I suspect, so I'm not talking about Alain Finkielkraut specifically, but I think that, first of all, there's this sort of idea that we have a realm of civilization that is everything in our lives, and then we have sex, in which we're supposedly animals. And in a way, what I do in my book, which is deeply uncool, is that I say, well, politeness, for instance, it would be great if it could happen also in sex. Like, there's no reason why our sexual lives are an outside of our moral lives. Like, we hold ourselves to standards in our moral lives, and we should hold ourselves to the same standards in sex. And I think one of the big problems of patriarchy is that it tells men, you don't need to be polite about sex. You don't need to respect other people's rights in sex, etc. Sex is your animality. You can't control it. You have this powerful desire that you can't control, and it's fine, and it's the part of you where you're an animal. And I don't think that's true.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just such a problem, the notion of sex. And I mean that in the richest, most delicious philosophical way, in that it's so meaty. There's so much there. It's so much more meaningful than a cup of tea. You know, if it's good and you're good at it, it can be so life-affirming. And then there's so much insecurity that factors into it as well, and so much reluctance to share one's actual experience with it. And we could talk all night about how sex can be wonderful as well, but we have to talk about the bad things as well, the problems, before we can get to the solutions. So I want to turn to the question of consent. And you, after you establish the fact that sex is a philosophical problem, you establish the fact that consent is not only a philosophical problem in its own right, but in fact it has a long philosophical lineage. It stems from Locke, from Mill, from Kant, and you arrive at the notion of consent that we have today, the predominant one, which is a sort of liberal definition of consent. Can you quickly explain to us what this liberal approach to consent is?
We all know it. So first of all, it's the idea that to consent to sex is to agree to sex. But then you're left there. And there's a big problem, right? Like, is to agree to sex to just not be against it? Or is it to really want it? Or is it to want it by the simple fact that you say I want it? Or is it to deeply want it? And so there we see, like, you can already see how there's going to be a very big disagreement, because some people would say, well, she hasn't said no, it meant she consented. And some other people would say, well, I thought retrospectively about what happened, and I don't think I fully consented, even if I said yes and I showed signs of enjoyment, but there was something going wrong there. So there's that is actually not as simple as it looks. But most importantly, you're presented with this idea that you have two people that are equal, that their gender doesn't matter, and that they kind of enter a sort of negotiation where they say, okay, I'm down to do whatever. But actually, and also about these two people, they know what they want. So this is kind of the image that we have of equals that are purely transparent to themselves.
They're in the private sphere. They're not interacting with the public at all. This is purely between them as individuals.
They're completely extracted from society. Yeah. But of course, like, society shapes what you can want, how you can know what you want, how you can know about yourself, know about the other, tell the other what you want. But also, we have a myth about consent. And the biggest one is that actually consent is women's consent. And this is something that everyone has in the back of their minds. Like, yes, you can be very woke, as some people say, and say, like, the consent of the man also matters. But ultimately, the reason why we think that consent is a problem of women is because, A, we hold the false view that men always want sex, that women never want sex, that they want love. And so therefore, sex is going to be a sort of point of a lose-lose negotiation where you give as little as possible to the other to get what you want. So you don't get a lot of sex because she doesn't want to give you sex, but you give her a bit of love, but not too much because you don't want to give love, something like that. And then that sex is the penetration of a vagina by a penis that ends when the penis ejaculates. And therefore, we see consent as a sort of QR code, you know, like you got the consent, you're free to go. You're free to go on the highway that is sex. And so that there's this sort of idea that we know what's gonna happen, that you don't need to talk about what's going on, about what you want, etc. Since, like, you know where it's going. It's going to the ejaculation of the man, and so there's gonna be, you know, like the I don't know how you say in English, the missionnaire. How do you say, like
missionary?
Missionary, yeah. And then maybe if you're a bit wild, doggy style, and then, you know, eventually the woman is gonna do something like ha ha ha, and the guy is gonna say, oh, I'm coming up, and that's done. And of course, you see that this is completely heterosexist. That actually this depiction of sex, we now know because of sexology studies, is absolutely not what might give pleasure to women. That it pretends that men always want sex, but it's actually not true. It pretends that women never want sex, it's also actually not true. And so it creates a model of what the relation between people can look like that is detrimental to everyone. And so one thing that I like thinking about is, you know, we have all these models about affirmative consent, that only yes means yes, but if we take affirmative consent seriously, it should be something like you could be at a party and go see someone and be like, just in case you wonder, for me it's a yes. But of course, when you present it like that, like a woman who would go to a man and be like, just in case you wonder, for me it's a yes, it breaks all the rules of what seduction is supposed to look like. And it was funny for me, so the first year I was in the US, I was at UCLA, and I was there with a friend of mine from France who was a male French guy, French guy, and who taught French with me. And I think he, like up until there, it had never happened to him, but arriving in California, being the French guy, like, all the students were crazy about him. So we would walk on campus and they would be like, bonjour, professor, and they were crazy about him. And everywhere we went, like, all the girls were like, oh my God, a French guy. And so one day we were at a bar, and I see him talk to a woman, and I see that he was really uncomfortable. And he came to me and he said, well, she offered to give me a blowjob. And I said no. And he said, but I thought my whole teenage years that this would have been my dream, you know, like a hot Californian woman coming up and saying, like, do you want oral sex in the bathroom? But it felt so weird that I said, like, don't you want to talk more? And so I thought it was very interesting. Like, I've been thinking about this story a lot because it shows how gendered our scripts are, that his desire was completely killed by this
By the
proposal.
expression of female desire.
Yeah.
That someone said, I want you.
Yeah, well, I think maybe it would have been, so I think what complicates things is that she was offering him unilateral oral sex. So it's also like, why would she want this, you know? Like, and there is a question about why is it a thing? I don't know. I think it's maybe changing, but why it was a thing in the 2010 that American girls felt like they had to give blowjobs all the time, and that, like, it was never reciprocated and it was fine, and that you had this idea that, oh, like, the vulva is a bit smelly and disgusting, but, like, the penis is
As
not.
is the penis.
Like, I'm not completely convinced about this, but there was this idea. No, but what I mean by that is that there's no reason to think that a penis is like that. Giving a blowjob in the toilets is way easier and nicer than giving oral sex to a woman. So
no, it's completely sexist. The idea that one genitalia is more or less pleasant than the other. That is just inherited from the patriarchy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so so that's the kind of things I want to try to think about.
And it's so interesting. You talk about this this idea of the relation of gender to consent and to desire in the book, and you say that consent in the bedroom, kind of consent in sex, is consent to a chain of events fully scripted and oriented toward men's pleasure. And I think that's such a succinct way of putting what you've been describing, that it's about, it will be penetration of the vagina by the penis. You make the point, and I'm sorry, we're getting quite vulgar tonight, but that's literally the point of this book, so we're just going to go with it, that if two partners, one male, one female, were to consent to sex in the bedroom, that would in no universe be consent to the woman putting a finger up the man's anus. That would be totally unacceptable. But somehow the reverse, which is vaginal penetration, is the norm. And so what we're missing here, the missing link that we need to address, is the fact that all sexual acts and all sexual desire happens under the influence of patriarchy. It is shaped by it and it reproduces it at the same time. And you make this point as a way to demonstrate the challenges of the liberal definition of consent, which is that it's two equal individuals separate from the sphere of the state entering to this sort of social contract to give each other mutual pleasure, when in fact that position of equality is a fiction. So can you explain to us how it is that sex itself is only possible under the sort of umbrella of this socio-political history, which has made men, and women.
Okay, that's a broad question, but I appreciate your very thorough reading of the book, and I'm gonna advertise your event that in February Katherine McKinnon is coming here and to talk with Kate Kirkpatrick, and I think so. What I mean by that is that, of course, none of this is like my own discovery that sex is political, but I think what I'm trying to do partly in the book is create or develop a conversation between moral philosophy, feminist legal theory, and take seriously the objections that feminists have against the notion of consent. And Katherine McKinnon, so you may not know her name, but you all know her because she's a legal theorist.
And you'll know her in February when she's at the library.
Yeah. But you have to imagine that she did two things that all of you know. She created the notion of sexual harassment. So imagine how she changed our lives to all of us. And B, she is the first legal lawyer who managed to have a court recognize rape as a war crime. So she really it's very important. So Katherine McKinnon says the way consent is defined is such that you could fuck a corpse and the corpse would be consenting. And so that gives you a sense of the problem with the legal definition of consent.
Can you explain why that is?
Because if you consider that consent is there unless you say no, of course she's being a bit polemical, and that's what makes her writing so fantastic, etc. But I think she has a point that there are ways in which legally the notion of consent serves to just hide the injustices, gender injustices that happen in sex. But contrary to Katherine McKinnon, and even if I have tremendous respect and admiration for her, I think there is something in the concept of consent. And so it was interesting earlier you were saying, we're not going to talk only about the good things, we're going to talk about the bad things. And I think what is very interesting about sex is that bad sex and good sex are very closely connected. But what I like about the notion of consent is that maybe it doesn't do enough of a great job to evaluate what are sexual violations, but there is an emancipatory power in the notion of consent that is, I think, very visible in the etymology. That consent comes from cum sentire, which means feeling with. And so consent, there is this idea of a joint action, and that the liberal model of consent is completely erasing this, and is completely erasing the potential, the happiness and emancipatory potential of consent. So this is what I'm trying to show, by precisely taking seriously all the objections of feminists. So if you read, I did the translation into English of my book with the help of some of my Yale students. And one of them, who's very sweet, at some point when we finished the chapter about the feminist objections to consent, he was like, I think I'm very, very depressed now. I see no future. He was like, I hope the next chapter is better. And so it's really conceived, the book is really conceived such that at some point you're like, we're really screwed. And in the both, and pun intended, you know? and then you're trying to I'm trying to find a way out. Yeah. But I think it's precisely when we understand how gendered sex is, how unjust sex is, how sex has been used as a power weapon, etc. How the vision that we're given of consent being between equal people is actually erasing the fundamental inequality between men and women, which is in heterosexual sex, but also in non-heterosexual sex, something that fundamentally shapes our sexual lives. Like, unless we understand all of that, there's no building a good sex life. Unless, and so that's why I think what I'm trying to do is take a step back from two discourses. I feel like consent has been used in a legal discourse and in a sort of therapeutical discourse. Like, some of you are American, so you may know Dan Savage. I was actually on Dan Savage's show, which I was very happy about. You know, so Dan Savage is this wonderful sex therapist guy, that gay guy who has the best last name in the world to do that. His name is actually Savage. And so he had this op-ed in the 80s called Savage Love that became now like a column in so many newspapers around the world. I found out it's actually even in Italy translated. And he has this radio show now where people, it's very sweet, like people leave messages on his, like on the answering machine of the show, and they say, well, this is what I'm dealing with in my sex life, and he's helping them to figure things out. So in that kind of discourse, consent is very important. It says, well, you need to talk to your partners, it's very important. And so you have these two discourses, but I think we need to take a step back and think, okay, like, what are good actions? What are bad actions? What are we looking for in terms of meaning of life, etc.? And what role does sex play in this? And how, and therefore, when we do that, we understand that the therapeutical discourse is missing the fact that all of this is social and socially defined and ideological also. And so there's no way that you're going to have a great sex life just by telling your partners, I want this, or telling your partner, I don't want that, because the way other people are having sex around you shapes your ability to have sex. So it needs to be also like a conversation among the sexes. When I say la conversation des sexes, I also mean, so so in French it's ambiguous precisely because it means it's a sexual conversation, but it's also a social conversation between the
Everyone's
genders.
Talking about sex. Yeah. And I think when you talk about the problems that these this sort of judicial legal approach to consent and then the therapeutic one poses, there are two that really struck me that kind of point straight to the heart of the tragedy of consent, the fact that it's such a good idea and it just doesn't quite work. And one is that when we talk about consent in America, we typically use the phrase no means no, and conversely yes means yes. But in fact, you point out, that frequently people don't say no when they should.
So I think this is a very important point, and thank you for raising it. So linguists have shown, and I think this is mind-blowing because when you start thinking about it, it seems obvious. You never say no in everyday life to say no to someone. When, like, if you have a coworker that you find extremely annoying who invites you for dinner at his place, you're never going to say no. you're gonna say, well, I would love to, it would be great.
I have a doctor's appointment.
Yeah, and I happen to be fully booked for the next 6 months, and you're gonna make excuses. Otherwise, if a coworker comes to you and say, do you wanna have dinner next week? And you say no, it's gonna be seen as extremely aggressive. And even more so if you're a woman. And so I think that's how this book is connected to my first book, is that the reason why I started like thinking so much about sexual consent and writing so much about sexual consent is because I was thinking, okay, like if it is true that part of what it is to be a woman is to be shaped and taught to be submissive, to always put other people's needs before yours, to be punished every time you're assertive, that it's you being bossy, that it's you being a bitch, that it's you being intense, that it's, because we were talking about this all the time, you know, like how at work there is always someone who, a woman who complains about something and people say, oh, you know how she is, she's really intense, you know? And so that's the best version of she's very difficult. And so if you're constantly shaped that way, how are you going to say no when someone is having is trying to have sex with you? Like, this is going to be extremely difficult. And on top of this, and I think this is very important, if you know that men get angry, if you know that men get violent when you say no to them, you know that by saying no, you're putting yourself at risk. And so this is one of the things that I show in the book. There are a lot of studies that show that the number one reason why women have sex they don't want is because they're scared of getting raped if they stop what is going on. And I don't know, so it's an American or partly American audience, so some of you may have heard about the short story Cap Person that came out in the New Yorker in 2017, and now they turned it into a movie that I think has like good sides and bad sides, but I went to see it last week and there's this sex scene, and it's fascinating because it's a very good, the reason why this short story had such success is because it got published right after the beginning of the Me Too movement, and it showed a woman having sex that she doesn't want, but that she's not forced to have, and that it's really between her and herself. It turns out the guy kisses her. It's a terrible kiss. She really, it's the worst kiss she's ever had, and so it's very funny because it's very well done in the movie. You see the kiss and you're like, oh. And because of gender norms, she thinks, oh, it must be he's so inexperienced, or maybe he's really worried. And so in a way, she's being kissed terribly by this guy, and it's extremely unpleasant. And then she has sort of flashbacks of him at his therapist saying, I was so intimidated, I couldn't kiss her properly. And so it turned her, even if the kiss is terrible, she kind of pities him and decides to go home with him when it was a pretty clear sign that it would be a disaster. And of course, the sex is absolutely disastrous. But what they did, like the scene, you see her standing in a part of the room while she's on the bed, so there's a doubling of her, and there is a conversation between her and herself, saying, "Why don't you stop it? You hate this. Like, please stop this." And the other her says, "Well, he's been very nice, and I'm here now." And she says, "Come on, like, you know better than this. You're a modern girl. And she says, "Yeah, but I'm at his place. What if he gets really angry?" And then the other her says, "So now you're saying because you're scared of being raped, you're gonna let him rape you?" And so there is this whole, and it's very funny because at some point he sees that she doesn't seem very happy, and so he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna take this slow, don't worry." And the other her says, "Oh no, please." And so it's very good. For me, it was crazy because it was the first time, and it's 2023, it was the first time I saw on screen an experience that I think a lot of heterosexual women have about like bad sex that is not impermissible, but the way patriarchy turns your sex lives into something disappointing. And so I think it's very important what you were saying about the fact that we know that the script of sex that is given to us is not susceptible to be pleasing for women. And so this is my sex ed moment, okay, like bear with me for a sec. But we know that 30% of women have zero sexual pleasure from vaginal penetration. That's enormous. And only 30% of women can have an orgasm just with sexual penetration, with vaginal penetration. And it's not because some women, like Freud thinks, are like well developed and are able to have a vaginal orgasm. There's no vaginal orgasm. There's only one thing called the clitoris that up until 2005 we didn't really know, because it's only in 2005 that there's the first MRI of the clitoris. You need to imagine 2005.
They didn't discover the clitoris until 2005?
Medically, like it was only like discovered as like the shape it had, etc. And so it's in 2005 that it was discovered that actually the clitoris touches the vagina, and that people who have orgasm through the vagina, it's because it's clitoral stimulation from the inside. So it's not two different kinds of orgasms. It's just that the clitoris is a very big organ, but that we didn't know because men always imagined that it was a small penis. But it absolutely doesn't have the shape of a penis. It has a sort of, French people recently realized that it looks very likely, very much like a bonnet phrygien, you know, that it's like this, but...
Like a what?
Bonnet phrygien, you know, the revolutionary hat.
Ah,
because it's like this and like this. And it's because of the Olympics, you know, because they did... So they did that. So in the Olympics, they did this figurine. They did this figurine for the Paris Olympics in form of the revolutionary hat, and feminists were like, "This looks exactly like the 2005 MRI of a clitoris." But of course, because it's guys who did it and who are not told what a clitoris looks like, it didn't occur to them. But all of this to say, like, you see. 2005, the clitoris, because up until there, it was mostly men, and men thought the clitoris is a mini penis. But the clitoris is not a mini penis.
I mean, there's so much more that we could get into there. I'm watching the clock tick, and we with pages and pages of talking points to get through. But I want to return to what you were saying, which is that no means no doesn't really work because women frequently don't say no. And then the other side of this, which we've been discussing...
they may say yes for wrong reasons.
Yes, is that yes might not mean yes because desire is socially constructed. And so we reach this stage where consent is this really useful and important tool, but it's not quite adequate. And then we reach this relationship with sexual desire where... we know that our desire is in some way socially constructed, that the pleasure I take from sex, the sex that I want to have, the positions you want to try out, the kinks you want to explore, are inherited from the socio-political context in which you have been raised in consuming media. But then on the other hand, and you point this out and it's brilliant, we also know that sex feels good and that we enjoy sex. So we both are...
It can feel good.
It can feel good. So we are... free agents who enjoy sex and want to have it, and then we're not free agents because our desire is socially inherited. Where do we go from there?
So I think where we go from there is to not do the sort of liberal thing that consists in saying, well, let's imagine we're equal and not socially shaped, and let's look at what our sex lives should be like. Because, you know, it's like the joke about the economist who's stuck on an island, on a deserted island, and say, let's assume we have a boat. Well, no, it doesn't work, you know. So it's the same. Like, let's not assume equality, and rather let's take seriously the fact that we're socially unequal, we're socially shaped, and how can we have emancipatory practices? And I think one of the important shifts that I'm trying to propose is, you know, like the Spider-Man, with great powers comes great responsibility. Instead of thinking it's women's responsibility in heterosexual relationships to stop this sort of mega phallus that is coming to them at all times, to say no, like it's men's responsibility to say, well, I realize that we live in a world where I have more power, where you're shaped to not express your power, your desire, etc. So it's my job to even the playing field. And I think you can never fully even the playing field, but there's something, you know, like if you're a professor and you want to have an authentic discussion with a student, you need to say a certain number of things, of saying, well, I want us to really discuss this freely. For this, like, I'm telling you, I'm not going to be mad at you if you disagree with me. You're not going to get the bad grade. You're not. So it's your role as the person in power to disarm your power as much as possible. It's never perfect, but it's your way of saying, like, look, I'm trying to make it a conversation of equals. And I think it's most often men, but it can be because of race and class. It can be sometimes the woman that is more in a position of power, and the person in a position of power compared to the other should be like, hey, like, yeah, clearly, like, I want to have sex with you right now, but it would be cool if you were to tell me, well, after all, I'm not in a mood, or if you were to tell me, well, maybe another day. So are you sure you really want this? And I think a lot of cases of unwanted sex happen because at no point the question is asked or the possibility is open. Because it's really hard if you are with someone who's starting to take your clothes off and taking it for granted that you and him or her are gonna have sex, to be like, whoa, let's calm down here. It's very brutal, it's very aggressive. You know that you might, even when it's good, well-meaning people, you know you might really hurt the feelings of the person. But if the person whose feelings might get hurt say, hey, like, my feelings are going to be a bit hurt, but it's part of it and it's really fine. Are you sure you want this? And if you don't want to have sex with someone and they say, are you sure you want this? You might say, yeah. And it's this person's responsibility that to see that you're saying, yeah, is not really a yes. And to be like, well, you don't seem like you actually really want this, so it's really cool. Like, let's do that another time. But I think it was interesting when I was in Canada, there were students who were telling me, oh yeah, like, now I never propose sex anymore because I'm like, I don't want the girl to feel like I'm pressuring her into sex. I think this is also not the right solution, right? So I think it needs to be possible to propose sex to people you want to have sex with, but in life we know how to propose things with accepting that it might not go great. So like, for instance, so I have very young kids and we have a book for them called the consent book, the yes or no book or something like that. And it says, and it's very funny that toddlers can understand this and adults are really struggling. It says, it's okay to have your feelings hurt when someone says no to you. And we need to be able also to talk about the fact that it hurts. You were really like down to have sex
really
tonight
wanted it,
and it's not happening.
And you might be disappointed. That's okay.
You can be disappointed without guilt tripping the other one. Yeah. You can be disappointed without being entitled. And so this is the switch that we need to...
This is the conversation.
Yeah, this is the conversation.
Yeah. Can we have a round of applause for Manon, please? We're going to open this up to audience questions now. So we'll start with our in-person audience, and if we have time, we'll turn to our Zoom audience as well. So raise your hand very high if you have a question. We're talking openly tonight, so don't be shy.
No, it's kind of a question, but kind of a comment. I don't... Okay. Okay, hello. So, women who say yes and don't actually mean it, probably, they might be looking for an aftermath of a relationship, and they think probably if they say no, they might be cutting themselves short of that possibility. And I've talked to a lot of people in my life and a lot of younger people, and this is actually what goes on. And I don't know if women want relationships more longer term, or if it's timing, I don't know, and men are not ready, or if they want to shop around. I don't know if women shop around as much. I'm not sure.
Well, the problem, you see here how, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you. But I think the problem is that it's not that easy. You know that a guy can have shopped around, as you say, for years, and it's going to make him look like he's really experienced and he's seen the world, etc. When a woman might look like damaged goods, like they say, I remember when I was a teenager in the south of France, the guys were always saying, only the train hasn't gone on her. Y a que le train qui est pas passé dessus. Which was, you know, like, and this was, I mean, you know, like, this is how women are socialized, by hearing those kind of things. Ah, celle-là, y a que le train qui est pas passé dessus. Like, and so you become damaged goods. And so there's this idea that in order to be in a relationship, you need to have protected yourself, also because men are taught that if you've had other partners, you might realize they're actually not that good in bed, and they're so worried about their penis size, as if like having a huge penis was great, because like again, men would be way less worried about their penis size if they were to understand the clitoris.
That's also an anxiety that they're socially taught. Like,
yeah.
Men are losing here too.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the problem is that like women are taught that it's important to have relationships, whereas men are taught it's important to have fun. And so, you know, like when I arrived I was talking about UCLA, when I arrived at UCLA, so it was in 2008, my students, because I was teaching French, and so one of the best ways to make them speak French was to ask them to tell me about dating in the US, and so they told me about the rules, you know, the book. You know, the rules, so it's called The Rules, or How to Get Mr. Right, or something like that. So it was a book of the 80s, or about all the things that you needed to do to like hook the guy. And so you have all this script that men are only going to be in relationship if you hook them by a bit of sex, but not too much, and that they need to want you, but if you give them too much, then they're gonna see you as a whore. And so, you know, and so all of this is an ideological script that is in the background of our sex lives. And so I think we need to make this visible, to think about what kinds of choices we make. Like, is it that we want a relationship, or is it that we think that if we're not in a relationship, our life is not going to be worthy, you know? Like.
Thank you. Do we have other questions in the room?
So I don't know if you saw, for instance, today there was a whole thing on social networks, because Time magazine put Taylor Swift on their cover with a cat on her neck, and they were like, as a sort, like it's a very cute picture. And a lot of guys on the internet have been like, oh, so now we valorize the non-married, childless women with cats. Look at, and it's Taylor Swift. Like, and they said like, older women with cats that are not married. And you're like, but it shows you a narrative, right? Like, as soon as a woman has a cat, like, no man is ever going to want her, and you know, but the best way to find a girlfriend is to have a dog when you're a guy, and to walk your dog, and you know, like, so we need to think about all of this. The philosopher that make jokes. That's what I do, sorry.
I'm just wondering, what was the film that you cited earlier?
Cat Person. Well.
You haven't mentioned pornography at all, and I wondered how you thought pornography played into issues of consent and sex, because I'm always struck by the prevalence of free pornography, freely available, you don't need to pay for it, and the images of sex that are vehicled through pornography now, which without wanting to be prudish, I find quite dangerous.
So that's interesting. So I oscillate because I am very convinced by a lot of arguments of Katherine McKinnon precisely against porn. And at the same time, so I think I'm among a group of thinkers that is thinking post-sex wars and post the victory of the sex-positive people of the sex wars. So we're like Amia Srinivasan, Kate Mann, me, we're thinking, okay, like the anti-porn feminists had a point. Because actually, yes, porn can be emancipatory, it can be great, it can be powerful, but it's not the porn that most people watch, right? Like the students, the kids, the porn they see is mainstream porn, and it's usually pretty disastrous, and the actresses are not well treated, etc. But I think I'm not sure porn is the problem as much as it is the symptom. Because the problem, so I think that might be where I disagree with McKinnon, and I see the idea, like it's true that you see that there's an habituation of a certain form of sexual violence, that it's true that it's such a representation that is demeaning to women, that is objectifying women, that is concerning. But the problem is also that so many guys are turned on by women being demeaned on screen, and so many women. And I don't know if some of you saw this today, but there's this, for the non-French of you, there's this very famous French actor called Depardieu. And it's not a secret. Everyone who works in cinema knows that he's been raping women, and he's been sexually harassing women, and it's always been like that. And today they leaked leaked images of him talking about women riding horses, and even small girls riding horses, and it's so horrible. Like, it's really horrifying, you know? But you see, like, this guy, he was, up until very recently, the most respected French actor, you know? Everyone thinks he's a genius, etc. And he's talked about, like, you see in this, like, 5-minute video, he talks about his penis probably like 50 times, and it's always been like that, and people have always accepted, you know, the uncomfortable uncle that always makes sexist jokes, and sometimes it's the dad or the granddad or the brother or the best friend or all of that at once. And I think in France it's particularly bad, right? But you know, these sentences like "y a que le train qui est pas passé dessus" and the other one that was, you know, there are terrible expressions like the people. So there is this expression that is "dick garage." She's a dick garage, you know, like but you know, like these are the things that we've heard. So is really porn the problem? I think porn is just a symptom of a much broader problem. So yes, it feeds it, etc. But I don't think little boys need porn to learn that it's okay to be degrading with women, that sexual violence is okay. Like everything else shows it. Like and in Cat Person, the guy is supposedly a fan of Harrison Ford. And so you see how it's based on, he's trying to be like Harrison Ford in all situations, but being like Harrison Ford, it's basically throwing women against walls, and they're gonna be like, no, 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 oh, yes. You know, like, it's always like that. Every James Bond movie, it's like, no, James, no, oh, yes, James, yes. Sorry? Yeah, but precisely. So it's the sort of standard of masculinity. So you don't need porn for this to happen.
Can we have a round of applause for Manon, please?
Thank you very much.